In every American infantry squad of World War II, every soldier knew they were walking on eggshells. However, there was one man who was already dead. He did not know it yet, but the enemy, or particularly the Germans, knew. While other soldiers moved forward with slim rifles and 10-pound packs, some men carried 20 pounds of walking death. These were the BAR gunners, arguably the most loved men in their unit, as these gunners were the only shield, while also being the most hunted men on the battlefield, because these were the Germans' biggest threat. This is the dark, heavy, and often misunderstood story of how one of America's most incredible World War II weapons also cost the lives of the men who loved it the most. To understand why this assault rifle became so important to both the Americans and the Germans, you need to know that necessity is the mother of invention, and the necessity for a weapon like the BAR was far worse than you can imagine. World War I is known to be a wake-up call for many nations, and when it comes to infantry warfare, it revealed a flaw that no army had ever thought of solving. Trench combat was a particularly famous tactic during World War I, but it also contributed greatly to turning the battlefield into a killing ground where a single moment of hesitation led to the death of many. The battlefield had adopted a predictable cycle. The first step was heavy artillery bombarding enemy trenches, forcing the enemy forces to stay underground. Now, in theory, this gave the attacking force a clear advantage, but the reality was different. The moment the shelling stopped, defenders would climb back to their machine guns. And now the attacking infantry was completely exposed and, frankly, at the enemy's mercy. As a result, the majority of the infantry was shot down before it could even make it through the open ground. The problem here was not a lack of firepower, but rather a lack of carrying it forward with the attack itself. And in such situations, if a unit resorted to fire and movement tactics, they were signing their own death warrant. If part of a unit stopped to fire while others advanced, the attack lost momentum and cohesion. If everyone advanced together, there was not enough suppressive fire to keep defenders pinned. Infantry needed something entirely new: continuous automatic fire that could move with the assault, not lag behind it. While static machine guns had proved to be particularly useful for defense, they also became ineffective once the unit had to move forward. It was clear what the battlefield needed: an automatic fire carried by a single soldier advancing step by step alongside the infantry line. The French were the first to seriously attempt a solution. Their answer was the Chauchat, a weapon that history often mocks for its poor reliability, but one that proved a critical concept. Chauchat teams were used aggressively, pushing forward during assaults, suppressing enemy positions, and even hunting machine gun nests with grenades and automatic fire. Conceptually, it worked. Mechanically, it did not. The long recoil system led to a lot of inconsistency in operating. Exposed components collected mud and debris, and American converted versions chambered in 30-06 performed even worse. While the Chauchat was an excellent demonstration of what the soldiers needed, it also showed why the execution was as important as the idea itself. The Germans approached the problem from the opposite direction. Their MGO 815 was a lighter version of the Maxim machine gun, technically portable, but still heavy, awkward, and dependent on crew operation. It could be moved forward in stages, but it could not advance fluidly with infantry under fire. Water-cooled, belt-fed machine guns were also popular in defensive warfare, but they were never designed to support fast-moving assaults across no man's land. In the end, mobility without true maneuverability solved nothing. When the United States entered the war in 1917, it arrived late, but not intellectually unprepared. Recent terrific experiences with the Spanish-American War and the Moro Rebellion had already changed American thinking about small arms, producing weapons like the Springfield 1903 rifle and the Colt 1911 pistol, both of which were incredible in practical combat use. Behind the 1911 stood John Moses Browning, already recognized as one of the most influential firearms designers in the world. By this point, Browning was not simply building weapons. He was solving battlefield problems. The U.S. Army referred to the solution it wanted as walking fire, but Browning saw this as a system upon which he could build his next invention. Instead of trying to shrink a machine gun, he designed an automatic rifle from the ground up. His goal was clear: a man-portable weapon chambered in full-power .30-06, capable of both semi-automatic and automatic fire, reliable in mud and filth, and light enough to be fired from the shoulder or hip while advancing. It was not meant to replace machine guns, nor was it designed for endless suppressive fire. It was meant to keep enemy heads down while the entire assault line moved forward together. Predictably, the early BAR doctrine made this purpose very clear. Soldiers were trained to advance using controlled semi-automatic fire, maintaining constant pressure without exhausting ammunition or exposing themselves unnecessarily. Fully automatic fire was reserved for the final moments of an assault, when closing on trenches, clearing enemy positions, or breaking resistance at close range. In philosophy, the original BAR was closer to a later assault rifle than a light machine gun, except that it fired a full-power rifle cartridge that hit hard, kicked hard, and had a long range. But despite being such a genius creation, the BAR could not benefit the men who carried it nearly as much as it benefited the units around them. The reason lies in timing, doctrine, and lost potential. Although more than 17,000 BARs were already in France by the end of July 1918, the weapon saw only limited action in World War I. General John J. Pershing deliberately delayed the widespread use, fearing that early deployment would allow German forces to capture examples, study them, and adapt. As a result, the BAR entered combat only in mid-September 1918, barely 2 months before the armistice. The war ended before soldiers could fully learn how to survive with it, and before doctrine could evolve to protect the men manning it. That delay would haunt BAR gunners later, when the weapon returned in a very different war. When the BAR was finally issued in large numbers during World War II, it became the centerpiece of the American infantry squad. Doctrine made it the squad's only automatic weapon, supported by a 3-man team: the gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. The BAR gunner carried roughly 220 rounds in 20-round magazines, while assistants carried more and were trained to take over immediately when the gunner fell. The wording here matters because it was when and not if. Every man in the squad received basic BAR training, because the Army fully expected the primary gunner to become a casualty. BAR gunners were trained to fire aggressively and visibly. Their job was suppression, not laying low. Once the shooting started, the BAR announced itself instantly through sound, volume, and sustained fire. German forces quickly learned that killing the BAR gunner was the fastest way to cripple an American squad. In fact, there were intelligence reports explicitly noting that German soldiers prioritized the BAR above all other targets. This meant the gunner had only a brief window, sometimes minutes, to inflict damage, reposition, or survive before drawing overwhelming fire. And this is where the saddest reality for BAR gunners, if lucky, they had roughly 30 minutes of life expectancy once combat began. Not because BAR gunners lacked skill or courage, but because the weapon forced them to become the most obvious, most dangerous, and most hunted men on the battlefield. If you thought this was the worst the BAR gunners had to face, you are wrong, because the danger didn't end when the trenches went quiet in 1918. The BAR didn't retire after World War I. It drifted. From battlefields into armories, and from armories into the American underworld. The same qualities that made it terrifying in war, power, portability, and volume of fire made it irresistible to criminals during the Prohibition era. Police departments at the time were still armed mostly with revolvers and shotguns. Against a Browning automatic rifle, they were completely outmatched. No one understood this better than Clyde Barrow. Barrow and his gang didn't just steal BARs, they modified them. He shortened the barrels, lightened the profile, and turned the weapon into another version. This modified weapon was compact enough to hide under an overcoat, yet capable of firing 30.06 rifle rounds at devastating speed. Law enforcement reports describe these modified BARs punching through engine blocks, cover, and multiple officers at once. For the first time, American police were facing battlefield weapons on city streets. The result was panic at the federal level. In 1934, the U.S. government passed the National Firearms Act, the first major federal gun control legislation in American history. This law didn't come out of abstract fear. It was a direct response to weapons like the BAR being used against law enforcement with no meaningful countermeasures. The BAR had become so frightening that it amended American law. Ironically, while civilians were discovering how terrifying the BAR could be, the Army was busy making it worse for the soldiers who carried it. In the late 1930s, the military introduced the M1918A2, an improved version meant to turn the BAR from a mobile assault rifle into a more traditional support weapon. Bureaucracy won over battlefield reality. A bipod was added. A flash hider followed. A rate reducer limited firing modes. By the time the process was finished, the gun weighed nearly 20 pounds, almost twice the weight of an M1 Garand. Soldiers hated it. In Guadalcanal, Italy, and later Western Europe, infantrymen quietly stripped the BAR back down. Bipods were thrown into jungles and hedgerows. GIs wanted Browning's original vision back, a fast, aggressive, mobile weapon that moved with the fight instead of anchoring it. The Army tried to make the BAR safer. Soldiers knew that slowing it down just made the man behind it easier to kill. Even in its best form, the BAR was fighting physics and design limits it could never overcome. The most obvious flaw was the 20-round magazine. Against German MG-34s and MG-42s, fed by 50-round belts and drum magazines, the BAR gunner was trapped in a brutal cycle. Fire for seconds, reload for seconds, expose yourself again. In a sustained firefight, that pause was often enough to draw lethal attention. Every reload was a signal flare. Heat made things worse. The BAR had a fixed barrel. There was no quick change system like the one the Germans used. Firing just 2 magazines on a fast automatic could cause the barrel to glow. Wood furniture would smoke. Accuracy dropped sharply. Gunners were forced to choose between suppressing the enemy or preserving their weapon, and hesitation meant death. There was no parachute built into the system, no margin for error. This made BAR gunners some of the bravest soldiers in the U.S. Army by necessity, not by choice. In both the Pacific and Europe, they were functionally unprotected during the most vulnerable moments of combat. Every 3 seconds, the gun stopped. Every stop was a chance for the enemy to end the fight permanently. The cost of this role is written into history through medals, not myths. A disproportionate number of Medals of Honor were awarded to BAR gunners. In fact, according to George Morihiro, the BAR gunner for the 442nd Infantry Regiment, the unit had 21 Medal of Honor recipients. Charles de Glopper at Normandy is one example of how BAR consumed the lives of its own soldiers. When his unit was pinned down, he stood in the middle of a road, firing his BAR openly to draw fire away from his men. He didn't survive. He wasn't reckless. He was doing exactly what the weapon and doctrine demanded. Predictably, he was awarded the Medal of Honor on March 10, 1946. He was also one of the 2 members of the 82nd Airborne Division to receive the medal. The BAR didn't create heroes because it was magical. It created them because it forced ordinary men into extraordinary, often suicidal positions. To carry the BAR was to accept that you would be seen first, targeted first, and remembered last if you survived at all. If you liked this walkthrough of the horrors of wartime history, do consider subscribing to the channel, as we will soon be back with yet another chilling reality of history.